The ground of the Jezreel Valley does not simply shake, it screams under the sudden, rhythmic thud of iron-rimmed wheels as a dust cloud erupts on the horizon. Out of that haze emerges a terror the ancient world had never truly witnessed, a chariot squadron that turned the open plains into a harvest of death for any who stood in its path. To the Israelite infantry, huddled on the jagged mountain slopes, this was not merely an approaching army, but an encounter with a superior system. The Canaanite formations surged outward from the fortified centers, claiming the flatlands and effectively isolating the hill country from the coastal trade routes. While these chariots moved at a velocity that defied the physics of a foot soldier, executing maneuvers with a mechanical precision that seemed to turn flesh into fodder, the infantrymen were left with no counter-move. To the men of Israel, these machines looked like invincible nightmares that possessed the speed of the wind and the cold, unyielding hardness of forged metal. They seemed to wield a power that human muscle and wood-carved spears simply could not touch. Yet to understand why these Israelites stood paralyzed and why they could not simply replicate such technology, we must look at the massive, hidden machine required to keep this iron running. The answer to their vulnerability lies in a secret weakness within the Canaanite economy that would eventually dictate the outcome of the entire war. The iron chariot was not merely a vehicle found in a simple barn, but the centerpiece of a high-tech city-state infrastructure that demanded a specialized supply chain beyond the reach of a nomadic people. There were professional stable masters who bred horses for specific temperament, alongside teams of highly trained blacksmiths who worked iron, a rare and expensive metal, to reinforce the axles and hubs of the wheels. Because these Canaanite city-states were wealthy global trading hubs built on taxation and slave labor, they were able to bankroll complex military assets that remained a status symbol of a society valuing stationary wealth and rigid hierarchies. For the Israelites, who were still largely living as tribal units scattered across the mountain hills, maintaining even a single war chariot was an absolute impossibility. While the Canaanite chariots patrolled the expansive valley floor in wide, aggressive arcs, the Israelite tribes remained constrained to the narrow defensive corridors of the central highlands. It required horses needing constant grazing, a perpetual supply of spare parts, and a centralized economy that Israel simply lacked. Rather than being mere soldiers, they were an army of infantrymen, accustomed to the rough terrain of the highlands, where they were protected by the sheer incline and the jagged rocks. In their world, they were kings of the mountain, but on the flat, open plains where the chariots roamed, they were merely targets. The existence of these chariots proved that Canaan was a civilization of power, while Israel was a civilization of endurance. It served as a reminder that some walls were built out of iron rather than stone, and some enemies were far more difficult to displace than others. As we peel back these layers of ancient tactical history to see how faith survives in the shadow of giants, consider subscribing to the channel to continue exploring the hidden realities behind the biblical text. Ultimately, the Canaanite chariots were the tanks of the ancient world, and they remained the primary reason the Canaanites held their territory so tenaciously, though this wealth came with a cost that the kings failed to calculate until it was far too late. Maintaining that expensive, high-maintenance logistical machine only mattered if you could find a battlefield that actually allowed it to move, which is precisely why the geography of the Jezreel Valley became the ultimate arbiter of power. The Canaanites understood the physics of their own weapons, refusing to engage in the narrow, rocky passes where a heavy chariot would become a death trap for its riders, preferring instead to build their cities around the flat expanses of the valley floors. They baited the Israelites with their presence, daring the mountain tribes to leave the safety of the crags and come down to the earth where the iron could do its work. The psychology of this was brutal, As an Israelite warrior felt the heavy burden of knowing his faith was tested not just by the sword, but by the terrain itself. To stay in the hills was to survive, yet to descend to the plains was to invite a confrontation with a technology manufactured specifically to hunt them. The word for trust in the Hebrew text is batash, a term appearing frequently in the Psalms that serves as the ultimate spiritual antithesis to the chariot. While the Canaanites placed their trust in iron, wheels, and the speed of their horses, Israel was forced into a lifestyle that demanded a complete reliance on divine maneuverability. The Israelite forces moved with calculated caution, skirting the edges of the plain and avoiding the primary chariot lanes, waiting for the precise moment when the geography itself would shift. They could not rely on their own weapons or a sophisticated logistics network. Instead, they were forced to learn that their greatest security was found in a God who did not play by the rules of human engineering. The chariots were expensive deities of the plains, demanding the kind of pride that claims a city is invincible because its gates are wide and its chariot squadrons are numbered in the hundreds. However, the irony of the iron chariot was its fragility, as it was a high-performance machine that could be rendered useless by a simple change in the weather or a shift in the mud. The biblical narrative reveals a God who constantly subverts the geography to show that the iron of the chariot is nothing compared to the power of the Spirit, and as the Israelite forces moved closer to the valley floor, the question remained whether their faith in the invisible God would hold up against the crushing weight of physical steel. If these chariots were truly the unstoppable tanks of the Bronze Age, the only way for the Israelite insurgency to survive was for their entire tactical reality to be fundamentally broken. It was broken, for in the narratives of the judges, there are moments where the sky itself seems to tilt against the Canaanites. When the rains came, they turned the hard-packed clay of the Jezreel valley into a quagmire of thick, clinging mud. As the storm broke, the once lethal chariot squadrons found themselves bogged down in the rising riverbeds, their mobility stripped away by the terrain they once dominated. In an instant, the high-tech, multi-ton weapons became nothing more than heavy, useless firewood, with wheels designed for speed now sinking deep into the sludge like a rusted gate. The riders who were once hunters became the hunted, and the infantry of Israel, who had learned to move over rocks and through scrub brush, suddenly found they possessed the mobility the Canaanites lacked. The iron was not removed by a counterweapon, it was removed by the earth itself, which turned against the arrogance of the builders. This is the heart of the matter, as the iron chariot was a declaration of human self-sufficiency that argued man could build his own salvation out of ore and horsehide. When the ground gave way, the chariot proved its own worthlessness, showing that God's tactical genius is rarely about providing a better weapon, but rather about revealing the failure of the one the enemy trusts in most. The Israelites learned that they did not need to be better than the Canaanites at engineering, because they needed to be better at trusting. Every time they looked down into the valley and saw the flash of iron in the sun, they were given a choice between the security of the city-state and the sovereignty of the Creator. They were forced to realize that the most advanced military technology is only as strong as the ground it rests upon, and that ground is held by the hand of the Lord. As you reflect on this, let us know in the comments, what modern-day technology or comfort are you tempted to trust in more than you trust in the sovereignty of God? When the battle reached its height, the Canaanites discovered that their iron could not save them, for their chariots became symbols of a failed legacy that was brittle in the face of a divine intervention. Today, these iron chariots serve as a permanent reminder to every reader that the things we build for our own security are often the things that fail us most spectacularly, standing as the final proof that no iron on earth can withstand the will of the King of Heaven.